to the 94th Aero Squadron, which shot down 69 enemy aircraft and earned him the Congressional Medal. His name was Eddie Rickenbacker, born this day, October 8, 1890. In his book, The Flying Circus, Eddie Rickenbacker recounts escaping death. I am not such an egotist as to believe that God spared me because I am I. I believe there's work for me to do, and that I am spared to do it just as you are.
This has been an American Minute with Bill Federer. For a free transcript, call American Minute at 1-888-USA-WORD.
VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
Due to the time-sensitive material covered at our most recent VCY rally in September of 2024, we have expedited the content into production that we might rebroadcast the information in record time so that you, our listeners, might be better equipped for these crucial days and weeks ahead. Crucial? Why crucial? I'm glad you asked. As we often say, buckle up. Have something to write with for note-taking, and then furthermore, for details on how you can order a copy of this entire rally to share with friends and family. At this rally, Gary Kaw from Hope for the World was our guest speaker. His presentation, The Globalist Agenda Exposed. Jim Schneider gave the formal introduction, which then prompted Gary to remember that it was 32 years ago when he had first spoken at a VCY rally, which was also held in southeast Wisconsin. But truly, with so much to cover, let's get underway.
Anyway, so much has happened since the 90s, but especially in the last few years, and even more so during the past 2 months. In fact, we do everything we can to stay on top of global developments. They're unfolding so quickly now, it's difficult to take in all the information. But the Lord has blessed us with about 3 or 4 dozen really key contacts around the world who we've recognized over the years, who are trustworthy and credible, and they are the ones that feed us most of the information that we get. So sometimes we find out 2 or 3 weeks in advance of events that are getting ready to go down, and we do what we can to get this message out. So just a very quick announcement before I get into the meat of things this evening. We just printed our fall issue of Hope for the World Update, our quarterly research journal, which Jim mentioned. It is packed each time with relevant, up-to-date information, important information that we have screened out that we believe that you need to be aware of. In the 2 opening paragraphs of my lead article in this issue, titled Going For It All, I wrote the following. Everything is moving at breakneck speed. Events that used to unfold over a period of months or even years are now happening in a matter of days. I'm finding it difficult to write this article when things in the political, economic, and military realms are changing by the hour. But this is the world we are living in, thanks to smartphones, social media, and deep state control of the mass media and much of the internet. Strategic propaganda put forth through these channels can sway public opinion in an instant. The prophet Daniel was told by the angel that knowledge would increase at a rapid pace during the end times. Daniel 12:4. And current events are certainly bearing this out. Knowing how to prepare our families for hard times is especially challenging when the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet. That's why it's so important to keep our eyes focused on the Lord, as only He can keep our hearts at peace in times like these. Jesus Himself must be our stability. No one else can provide peace of mind and the assurance of our eternal destiny. Only Jesus can do so. With all the rapidly changing global developments taking place, it is so vitally important that we have complete confidence in the Lord. So before we get too far into our current national and world situation, let's first go to the Word. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from Psalm 2. David wrote, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. But the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. But blessed are all who take refuge in him." This passage reminds us that ultimately God is in control and he will have the final say. No matter what scheming and planning powerful people do in this world, and they'll be able to move their agenda forward, but in the end, our Lord Jesus Christ will have the final say. And I want to begin with that and drive that point home because we're going to cover some heavy stuff this evening. And I just want us all to be prepared. I want to begin and end on a positive note. For just a few minutes, I'd like to comment on our current political situation here in the U.S. because it needs to be addressed. We're living in unprecedented times, and things are getting ready to happen that unless the Lord intervenes, our lives could change drastically very, very quickly. So bear with me. If I step on some toes this evening, that's not the intent. Hear me out all the way through, please. We are just weeks away from a political event of enormous consequence. Not since the 1860s has our nation been so divided. We're not only divided, but greatly deceived as a nation. A huge percentage of our populace has fallen for the propaganda of socialists who have cleverly seduced tens of millions of Americans with their empty promises and outright lies. The fact is, socialists dedicated to a globalist, antichrist agenda are now firmly in control of most, and I do mean most, of our government agencies. There appears to be no going back, as history has shown that once socialists are in power, they stay in power, often by force if necessary. Venezuela is a prime example. This once proud and prosperous nation came under socialist leadership when Hugo Chavez became president in 1999. He wasted no time in turning the country on its head, nationalizing entire industries and putting them under his administration's direct control, while eliminating personal freedoms and the free enterprise system that had enabled Venezuela to excel. At one point in time, it was the second most wealthy nation on earth on a per capita basis. A lot of people are not aware of that. When Chavez died in 2013, his accomplice, Nicolas Maduro, stepped in and continued on the same path, completely destroying whatever was left of the country's once vibrant economy. On July 28th of this year, Venezuelans tried to oust Maduro, preventing him from serving a third 6-year term. The opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez received, it's believed, more than double the votes of Maduro in what was a landslide victory over his Marxist rival. But despite this overwhelming vote against socialism by the desperate Venezuelan people, Maduro declared victory and remains in power to this day. He and his henchmen have spent the past 2 months rounding up the opposition and placing them under house arrest. Do we think it can't happen here? People of Venezuela didn't think it could happen, but it did. Unfortunately, the United States is on a track very similar to Venezuela. Socialism has been made fashionable. The media has made its ideals, presented in the name of compassion and tolerance, sound incredibly appealing. And now that the leftist, Joe Biden, has more or less been forced out, Kamala Harris, who is even more radical, has become the new face of America's socialist movement. The inner sanctum of globalist handlers has anointed her to be their next political puppet, with the goal of dismantling whatever good is left of America and forcing us into their anti-Christian New World Order. If she is elected, the Marxist takeover of America will be much closer to being complete. We have seen this move coming for a long time. Even before the election of 2020, I had become aware that Harris was the real choice for president by top globalists, as unlikely as that may seem to some conservatives. However, they could not get around Joe Biden, who felt entitled to the presidency and had enough old-school Democrats on his side to pull it off. So the global elite worked through Harris and other operatives they placed within the White House to push their extreme agenda, only dumping Biden once he was no longer useful to them and had become a liability. In our fall 2020 election issue 4 years ago this month, I wrote the following paragraphs as a warning to our readers. I wrote, "It is clear that Joe Biden has become a mere figurehead for the far-left socialists who now commandeer the Democratic Party. Their real champion is Kamala Harris, a hardcore liberal socialist who is entirely dedicated to the climate change, pro-United Nations, one world agenda. If the Democrats win, Harris and her behind-the-scenes accomplices, not Biden, will really be in charge. Things in the U.S. would drastically change. There would be no turning back as the number of ultra-liberals in the U.S. is growing, thanks to the combined efforts of leftist university professors, the social and conventional media, Hollywood, high-tech moguls, and millennial followers of BLM and AOC, the majority of whom are dedicated socialists. For now, at least, Kamala Harris is the favorite darling of the far-left elites. 2 years ago, in our fall 2018 issue, I wrote the following as a heads up. Keep your eyes on California Senator Kamala Harris. She is a rising star within the Democratic Party and is rapidly gaining popularity among millennials. She is attractive, intelligent, well-spoken, and extremely liberal. Some political insiders believe she has her eyes on the White House.
Were you following along? Gary Kaw wrote those words, bringing attention to then California Senator Kamala Harris, a hardcore liberal socialist who is entirely dedicated to the climate change, pro-United Nations, one world agenda. Well, Gary is just getting started. His presentation, The Globalist Agenda Exposed, will continue after this first break. This is Crosstalk on the VCY America Radio Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist and creation researcher with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, what can you tell me about Neanderthal man?
Chris, from a biblical perspective, Neanderthal man was a human just like me or you. They evidently were an ethnic group that migrated away from Babel, living in very harsh conditions, but were human nonetheless. Archaeological discoveries have shown that they used agriculture, they buried their dead, they had art, musical instruments, they were humans just like me and you. Those who assigned them to subhuman categories suggested that they didn't have the right kind of hands to use tools, but a recent study has shown that they had thumb and forefingers just like ours with just as much dexterity. In every sense, they were as human as you and me, descendants of Noah, souls for whom Christ died. Going back to Genesis makes all the data fit so well.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more on creation, visit our website at www.icr.org.
Crosstalk today is featuring the audio of Gary Kah's presentation, The Globalist Agenda Exposed, as it was given at our most recent VCY rally in September of 2024. Just before the break, Gary was sharing insight into some things that he first wrote about Kamala Harris back in 2020 and 2018. Let's continue.
Some political insiders believe she has her eyes on the White House. In order to become her party's nominee, she would have to first overcome some of the older establishment liberals, such as Joe Biden. Now back to 2020. Well, she's almost there. If the Biden-Harris team wins, she will be only one heartbeat or mini-stroke away from being our commander-in-chief. For a while last year, she was closing in on the lead in the polls. But then during one of the prime-time debates, she made the mistake of revealing her true self by demonstrating her more vicious side. As a result, she lost momentum. But nonetheless, the far-left elite found a way to get her on the ticket. They are betting that the country will vote for her if she is teamed up with a perceived moderate. If Biden and Harris pull off this win, it is very likely that she will become president sometime during the first term. There is no way that Joe Biden can endure the pressures of the White House for 4 years, given his mental and physical state. But even if he could, he would be a puppet. Harris would be running the show. More accurately, it would be her most powerful socialist backers who'd be calling the shots through her. End quote. This is pretty much how things are playing out. Biden is still technically president, but he's been replaced already before the end of his term. And there are other people behind the scenes much more powerful calling the shots. Kamala Harris is a lot of things, but stupid she is not. Although she is not particularly gifted in fielding on-the-spot questions and has become notorious for her word salads, one does not get to where she is without being very calculating and very committed to the agenda of the global socialist insiders. She is completely sold out to the one world cause. Her choice of globalist Tim Walz, the most far-left governor in the country, as her vice presidential running mate, says a lot. Also, a little-known fact, I've heard 2 media outlets mention it in the last 10 days. Kamala's father was a Marxist professor. So her roots run very deep, even through her own family. And you're just not hearing this through the mass media. Kamala's constant cackling, I believe, serves as an artificial cover for her true disposition. Close to 90% of her original staff members, despite being leftist liberals like herself, quit their jobs. They could not handle working for her. They couldn't put up with her condescending treatment. Kamala is known to be harsh and demeaning, but in public she effectively puts on a friendly, non-threatening face. That's all part of the act. Then there's Trump, a man who I believe loves his country and is an open book. What you see is what you get. We would agree with most of his policies, which uphold our Constitution, promote free enterprise, and defend our borders. However, he is his own worst enemy. His rambling, name-calling, and sometimes degrading childish remarks cause some who would normally support him to reject him to the point of not voting for him. Donald Trump would have at least 5% more votes if he could simply tame his tongue. But this seems virtually impossible for him to do. After the first assassination attempt, he appeared to change his demeanor, but this only lasted for a few days. He quickly returned to his usual self. It's as if he can't help himself. Trump will be Trump, but his provocative taunting of opponents, particularly at his rallies and press conferences, could cost him the election. He won't attract the new voters that he needs in order to win if he keeps it up. He needs to stick to the issues. Most recently, since the second attempt on his life, Trump has been focusing more on policy and less on some of the petty personal attacks. So hopefully this will continue. Pray for him on this matter. His closest advisors who love him and encourage him are telling him the same thing. But it's very hard for him to discipline himself. He's so tempted to run with certain things, and it's not helping him. Right now, the race is too close to call. Women voters favor Harris by a huge margin. This presents a real problem for Trump, especially since women have outvoted men in every election since 1980. In order to overcome this obstacle, he will have to secure about half of the Hispanic vote and an increased number of black voters, along with carrying as much as 70% of white males, a very, very tall order. In this extremely tight race, the outcome could depend on the political weight carried by RFK Jr., who recently ended his own campaign to endorse Trump. Personally, if I were Trump, I would offer Kennedy the headship of either the CIA or the Justice Department, or appoint him as America's top health official once elected. Some of you are too young to remember his father, Bobby Kennedy, who was assassinated in the 1960s. He was perhaps the most effective U.S. Attorney General we ever had when it came to rooting out crime. What Rudy Giuliani did in New York, cutting crime down by 2/3 fairly quickly, he was doing at the national level. And the powers that be couldn't have that. They couldn't put up with that. He was assassinated. But he was a very good U.S. Attorney General. And I believe that RFK Jr., like his daddy, loves this country and is a patriot. We may not agree with all of his views on everything, but I believe he would uphold our Constitution and do what he could to keep us a free nation. My belief is that unless Trump and Vance are ahead by at least 3 or 4% in a given state going into the election, they will invariably lose that state because of all the clever tactics and maneuvering that the social establishment is capable of. They have a lot of tricks up their sleeve and will do anything to win. If the race stays close and they believe Trump might win, one of their options may include trying to take him out a third time. At this point, I wouldn't put anything past these people. I strongly encourage all of you to fervently pray for God's protection over Donald Trump and Bobby Kennedy, both of whom are putting their lives on the line for our nation, and also pray that the Lord would cause great confusion among our adversaries, rendering them inept and ineffective in their plans and actions. It is not wrong to pray that way. It's actually scriptural. And I would also say pray for J.D. Vance. Their biggest target right now, in my view, is Trump and Kennedy. But Vance also is towing the line with Trump. And so nothing can be ruled out between now and January. Given the volatile state of things here and abroad, we need to be prepared for sudden changes on a variety of fronts. The list of potential crises that can quickly be brought to a head by globalist powers is quite long. They are not without options. If by the end of this month or early in October, they are unable to significantly reduce Trump's popularity or remove him from the ticket somehow, I believe they may take further drastic measures that could even lead to martial law. The powers that be could manipulate our country into World War III. They could crash the stock market or introduce a new pandemic or enable a terrorist attack, possibly targeting our power grid, among other things. If, however, the Harris-Walz ticket keeps momentum and appears to be on the path to victory, they may allow the race to play out, knowing that they still have 2 months after the election to pull off a surprise in case their candidates lose. There is another possibility. What if Trump and Vance are victorious against all odds? Would the socialist establishment immediately bring the house down, so to speak, or might they wait until Trump is actually reinstalled as president, then unleash chaos and havoc on all fronts? This latter tactic would place the blame for all the calamity on Trump and those who voted him back into power. This would be the socialist retribution against Trump and his freedom-loving deplorables for opposing them. But would they be willing to risk Trump returning to the White House? I don't know. What I do know is that every person in this room must get out and vote. Don't let anything stop you. It's not only a privilege, it's a duty to vote as a U.S. citizen. So take advantage of that. While Americans are captivated by this very heated political race, conflicts overseas are poised to escalate into much larger, more threatening wars. The Ukrainian military has crossed into Russia and taken control of a number of villages. This offensive measure, made possible by weapons and tactical support from the U.S., has heightened tensions and moved us a big step closer to World War III. Meanwhile, tensions between Israel and Iran and its proxies have reached an all-time high. The possibility for sudden escalation into a large-scale Mideast war is growing. If the globalist powers that be need these wars to expand in order to achieve their purposes, then things will escalate further, unless God intervenes. Add to this the fact that the United Nations is just one step away from being able to seize control over all its member nations, including the United States, in the event of an international emergency. Now you say, how can I say that? Well, the UN has been very busy this year laying the groundwork for exactly such a power grab. One of their efforts already took place and partly failed, but a second effort with huge implications will take place beginning tomorrow.
Well, that to which Gary is referencing is the Summit of the Future, which is actually now in the past. In fact, Jim dedicated an entire crosstalk to the subject back on September the 23rd, and you can hear that at crosstalkamerica.com. When we return from this break, Gary will actually unpack these two attempts this year by the World Health Organization, which would usurp our nation's sovereignty. I am sure that you know one or more people that could benefit from today's broadcast. So for a CD, or even better, a DVD of this presentation, The Globalist Agenda Exposed, call our switchboard at 1-800-729-9829 or visit us at vcy.org.
Imagine if you could change society's stance on abortion.
How do you feel about the issue of abortion?
I think in some situations it can be necessary.
So have you just changed your mind about abortion?
Yeah.
Would you ever vote for someone who was for the killing of children in the womb?
No.
I believe in someone's right to choose.
You're going to change your stance on it?
Yeah, it's definitely making me think, yeah.
What was the compelling question to change people's minds on abortion? From Ray Comfort comes the DVD 180, featuring street interviews in which people who were pro-abortion changed 180 degrees to pro-life.
So have you just changed your mind about abortion?
Yeah.
180 is available for a donation to VCY of just $5, 5 copies for a donation of $18, or 10 copies for a donation of $25. Call 1-800-729-9829. Ask for the DVD 180. Crosstalk today is featuring a presentation entitled The Globalist Agenda Exposed by its author, Gary Kah from Hope for the World. Learn more at GaryKah.org. Gary, K-A-H.org. Talk about exposing an agenda. Lay ears to this, which the UN has been cooking up.
Let's unpack these two globalist efforts to take away our freedoms. Back in May, the 77th World Health Assembly convened in Geneva, Switzerland. We followed the lead up to that meeting for almost a year, as globalists were preparing, with help from the Biden administration, to grant the World Health Organization unprecedented power over nations in the event of a declared health-related pandemic. I did at least a couple of programs with Jim on Crosstalk regarding that. So those of you who listened to that know that we were out in front of this, warning as many people as possible. Democrats in Congress have generally backed this plan, with Republicans generally opposing it, opposing the empowerment of the World Health Organization. But this global pandemic agreement that they were proposing had been in the making for over 2 years, with the Biden administration being involved even in crafting its wording and advising WHO officials on how to proceed. Realizing that he would likely receive pushback from conservative members of Congress, Biden from the outset has referred to the draft in progress as an accord or an agreement, when in fact it is an international treaty. You see, a treaty requires approval by 2/3 of the Senate, which Biden would be unlikely to obtain. So by declaring it an accord, he was hoping to bypass congressional approval. He made clear that he would approve and sign the document no matter what. And we can be assured that Kamala Harris, if president, would do the same. They're very committed to this. Fortunately, early this spring, conservative political leaders finally began to recognize the dangerous ramifications of this treaty if ratified. This resulted in a joint letter from 24 U.S. governors condemning the treaty negotiations being conducted by the Biden administration. They opposed the plan because, if ratified, it would grant to the World Health Organization unprecedented and unconstitutional powers over the United States and its people. Their words. The governors wrote in their letter, I quote, "The objective of these instruments is to empower the WHO, particularly its uncontrollable Director General, with the authority to restrict the rights of U.S. citizens, including freedoms such as speech, privacy, travel, choice of medical care, and informed consent, thus violating our Constitution's core principles. If adopted, these agreements would seek to elevate the WHO from an advisory body to a global authority in public health." End quote. Now, just a little bit of background on Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization. At one point, he was a socialist revolutionary leader in Ethiopia that caused a whole lot of bloodshed in that country. And he's been close to China for decades. This man is now the director of the World Health Organization. That was his reward for being a Marxist. The letter I was just talking about from the 24 governors did create positive momentum in calling attention to the World Health Organization's scheme and the Biden administration's involvement in it. On May 1st, all 49 Republican senators signed a letter to Joe Biden urging him either not to sign the pandemic treaty or, if he does, to submit it to the Senate for approval as required by the Constitution. Among other things, the letter stated, I quote, "We are deeply concerned that your administration continues to support these initiatives, and we strongly urge you to change course," end quote. This was followed by a May 8th letter from attorneys general in 22 states urging Biden not to sign the WHO agreements. The letter also stated that they will resist any efforts by the WHO to set public health policy in their states. Many Americans do not realize that the authority to deal with health issues rests largely in the domain of the states, outside the grasp of the federal government. The Biden administration, in collaboration with the WHO, is seeking to change that. The letter from the attorneys general was to the point, warning, quote, "Ultimately, the goal of these instruments isn't to protect public health. It's to cede authority to the WHO, specifically its Director General, to restrict our citizens' rights to freedom of speech, privacy, movement, especially travel across borders, and informed consent," end quote. This battle being waged over health, pandemic matters has pitted the states against a corrupt federal government which is in cahoots with the United Nations and its subsidiary, the World Health Organization. A growing number of states, I believe, will consider laws declaring that they will not obey WHO directives, regardless of what the federal government mandates. Florida, for example, recently passed such a law. So did Louisiana, and other states are lining up now to make clear that they will not go along with this power grab. As a result of opposition from U.S. citizens and their state leaders, together with a growing number of concerned groups from other nations, the WHO was forced to modify some of the wording in the treaty and to postpone the final vote. Tens of thousands of concerned citizens from around the world turned out in Geneva, Switzerland to protest the World Health Assembly's meetings. The results of the 77th World Health Assembly, which is the governing body of the World Health Organization, represent at least a temporary victory for the people of the world. This assembly essentially took 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The assembly's purpose was to strengthen the WHO, something it accomplished through the amendments, but only in a limited way, as these amendments remain non-binding for the time being. Overall, these meetings failed to accomplish the WHO's principal goal, the full authority to enforce its mandates globally during a health-related emergency. Moving forward, being aware that this battle is not over, they're going to try it again later this year, and if necessary, next May at their 78th meeting. Here are a few details to be aware of. You will not hear this through the mass media. At least I haven't heard it thus far. But I just want to mention 4 points here about this effort. The Biden-Harris administration put forth 13 of the most important amendments to the international health regulations to facilitate the strengthening of the WHO. In other words, they essentially started this process. The administration's inner circle is in deep, very tight, with the World Health Organization. They're practically one and the same thing, and we have not been told that as a people. Secondly, 194 nations, which is almost every country in the world, are currently part of the World Health Organization. Thirdly, the World Health Organization has full immunity rights and can't be taken to court, meaning there is no way to prosecute World Health Organization officials for wrongdoing under international law. That, to me, that's criminal, but that's a fact. That's where things stand right now. The fourth point, the WHO is a sub-agency of the United Nations. They exist under the UN. These aren't two separate organizations operating completely independently. The WHO exists under the auspices and approval of the United Nations. This last point is especially relevant. Here's why. The UN General Assembly is convening a special session tomorrow and Monday, September 22nd and 23rd, which they have decided to call the Summit of the Future. At this summit, the UN will seek to ratify what they are calling a pact for the future, which would give its Secretary General emergency dictatorial-like powers on an international scale in the event of a global crisis. Just a few details on Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. During the time that he was president of Portugal, part of that time he was also the world leader of an organization called the Socialist International, which is the mothership for all the top socialist organizations in the entire world. His reward was being made Secretary General of the United Nations. So arguably, the two most powerful people within the UN system have very deep socialist Marxist roots, which explains why things are going in the direction that they're going in. But again, you will not hear this through the mass media. If the UN is able to ratify this upcoming pact and gain these unprecedented powers, it could well argue that its mandates can be enforced through the WHO, since that agency, as I mentioned, operates under the auspices of the UN. If the United Nations indeed has jurisdiction over the World Health Organization, it could do whatever it wants during an international crisis, if this pact for the future is ratified. Such deliberate action by a corrupt anti-America and anti-Israel UN would render the recent partial victory over the WHO meaningless and would represent an end run around our national sovereignty. Do you understand what I mean? We dealt them a slight defeat back in May, but if this upcoming session, if all this goes through, it could override whatever happened back in May. This is one of many reasons why I believe the United States and other countries will probably find as their only option, if they want to remain free countries, that they withdraw their membership from the UN and its sub-agency, the World Health Organization. This is the only sensible action to take if the free nations of the world wish to remain free. If the free nations of the world wish to remain free and independent of a draconian world government regime. Right now, I'd like to walk you through some of the specific plans and details of this summit and the pact, the agreement that they are proposing, which is really a treaty. As the revised draft of the Pact for the Future, the summit's core document states, quote, "Our challenges are deeply interconnected and far exceed the capacity of any single state," meaning country, "alone. They can only be addressed collectively," end quote. You've heard the mantra before, global problems demand global solutions. Well, this is them putting that on steroids. Thus, the United Nations must be reformed to meet these international challenges. So goes the narrative and propaganda. So toward that end, almost 60 action points are laid out in their working document. These are areas of agreement to be committed upon by national representatives.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewtube.com. This week, there was a very important case before the U.S. Supreme Court. The ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, is arguing a new rule known as readily convertible. And what it means is if you could readily convert your semi-automatic AR-15 into a machine gun, it should be confiscated. If you could take your shotgun and have a short barrel put on, even cut it off and make it a short barrel, it should be confiscated. Same thing with your rifle. So before the U.S. Supreme Court today, there were gun rights attorneys arguing that this new readily convertible test would wreak havoc on our Second Amendment rights. It's time for Christians, pastors, Americans to understand we have God-given rights of self-defense. It's in the Bible. Only a wicked government seeks to disarm its people so they can carry out their brutality and murder. There is a biblical worldview to be applied here. Let's do it.
Well, final segment for today. God willing, and we will pick this back up tomorrow. Just before the break, Gary was explaining this treaty, if you will, that the UN is trying to put into place over the entire world through the so-called Summit of the Future.
Right now, I'd like to walk you through some of the specific plans and details of this summit and the pact, the agreement that they are proposing, which is really a treaty. As the revised draft of the Pact for the Future, the summit's core document states, quote, "Our challenges are deeply interconnected and far exceed the capacity of any single state, meaning country, alone. They can only be addressed collectively," end quote. You've heard the mantra before, global problems demand global solutions. Well, this is them putting that on steroids. Thus, the United Nations must be reformed to meet these international challenges. So goes the narrative and propaganda. So toward that end, almost 60 action points are laid out in their working document. These are areas of agreement to be committed upon by national representatives tomorrow and the next day. Here are a few examples from that draft in their own words. They say, quote, "Plan for the future and strengthen our collective efforts to turbocharge the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by 2030 and beyond. Secondly, fulfill our commitment to comply with the decisions of the International Court of Justice in any case to which our state is a party." Again, when they say state, they mean country. Third, address the challenges posed to international peace and security by adverse climate and environmental impacts. Fourth, support the Secretary General to strengthen the United Nations role in science, technology, and innovation. Fifth, strengthen the United Nations system. And sixth, accelerate the reform of the international financial architecture so that it can meet the challenge of climate change. These are some of the most important things. They want to tie everything in with the environment and set up a bunch of restrictive rules, and countries or individuals who do not abide by them will be severely penalized, and it will become almost impossible for them to function. So a lot of this is moving forward in the name of the environment and also health management. The draft offers pages and pages of recommendations, including taxation coordination between member countries and exploring, quote, options for international cooperation on the taxation of high net worth individuals, end quote. And they also talk about universal health coverage internationally. So all this has to be paid for somehow. If you have a whole new layer of government at the international level, we're going to be taxed for it to make it possible. And they talk a lot about that as well. From global economic governance to supporting indigenous spiritual culture to tightening the relationship between the UN and regional authorities, the list of recommendations and proposals is long. But the bottom line is this: the UN wants to be fully empowered, and in turn, to manage a range of complex issues at the global level. Supporters of UN empowerment are referring to this as UN 2.0. Like all other UN summits, there is more to the picture. An extensive preparation process usually precedes main events like this. Actors in this process involve special interest groups, non-governmental organizations, academic associations, and international institutions. Conferences take place both within and outside the UN system, and reports are compiled and published, and momentum is generated as these different players stretch the boundaries and push the agenda forward, all in advance of a summit such as the one that's getting ready to start. So there are so many organizations involved in this behind the scenes. We had to decide on a few of them to share as an example of what they're up to. So the first one of these is the Vatican. On March 4th and 5th, the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences hosted a workshop on the Summit of the Future, with participation from the Muslim Council of Elders, regional and global banking representatives, including some from Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank, along with former and current UN officials, governmental ministers, and academic experts. As the workshop agenda book describes it, I quote, "At the very heart of Pope Francis's messages in the past decade has been the urgent need for a strengthened multilateralism to address the growing ecological and social crises of our age," end quote. We've been aware for years and have been reporting on it as tactfully as we can that Pope Francis is actively supporting this agenda. He even has some of his own representatives he sends to the annual meetings of the World Economic Forum. Many of my Catholic friends have become aware of that and are trying to take a stand, but it's very difficult through the mass media. It's just certain things they won't touch, and this is one of them. The second organization I want to touch on, very powerful behind the scenes, is called the Climate Governance Commission, or the CGC, the Climate Governance Commission. The CGC is a working group attached to a larger body known as the Global Governance Forum. In 2023, the CGC issued a report titled Governing Our Planetary Emergency, paid in part by the Rockefeller Foundation, which examined the climate change agenda in the light of future governance. You might say future world governance. The report specifically highlighted the Summit of the Future, along with other UN events, as a milestone to, quote, move the planet through a swift and just global transition, end quote. They want to make this happen fast before people wake up to it.
Well, again, part 2, God willing, coming tomorrow, as there is still so much to share from the presentation, The Globalist Agenda Exposed, by Gary Kah. Audio CDs and or DVDs are available now when you call 1-800-729-9829 during normal business hours or online at vcy.org. We'll pick this up tomorrow. Take care.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.